It was the roads, miles upon silent miles. For David, the asphalt was a demanding mistress, a jealous god who stole what mattered most. He thought he was building a future, but in truth, he was building a void. For years, the passenger seat of his rig sat empty, a silent ghost of all the life he wasn't living. He never expected that one day, the very highway that separated him from everything would be the one thing that forced him back home. This is not a tale about trucks, but about the weight a man can carry, and the moment of redemption that waited for 25 years. If you like stories that touch the heart, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. David, 52, smelled of diesel, stale coffee, and regret. His blue eyes, once vivid with the spirit of the open road, now carried the dust of thousands of miles traveled, each wrinkle around them a reminder of a lost birthday. He lived on Long Haul 8, as he called his cab, a micro-apartment on wheels. His routine was a monotonous rhythm of neon-lit gas stations, roadside diners, and the constant thrum of the Cummins engine. He always said it was his life, but that life had swallowed him whole. In the glove compartment, there was a worn photograph. A 7-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile, clutching a broken toy. Chris, his son. David looked at it during the rare moments of silence, usually parked in some isolated spot in Texas or Iowa, where the night sky was vast and the loneliness overwhelming. He tried to justify the absence. It was all for him. But money never filled the empty chair at the dinner table. He remembered the smell of fresh-cut grass in Ohio and the sound of Chris's laugh. Those memories were now precious fragments, agonizingly distant. David's silent pain wasn't physical. It was the weight of distance, the certainty that he was a stranger to his own flesh and blood. He prayed the engine wouldn't stop, because when it did, the thoughts came in avalanches. The first sign that his life, built on miles of asphalt and perfectly isolated, was about to crack came not in the form of a dramatic letter or confrontation. It came from a dry, short, and coldly transactional text message. David was unloading a shipment of steel coils, the heavy cargo vibrating beneath his boots, in a noisy, dusty Atlanta yard. The smell of burnt diesel and sweat saturated the hot midday air when his phone, clipped to the dashboard of his Peterbilt, chimed with a sharp, insistent ping. It was Chris, now a 25-year-old mechanic, speaking with the professional precision of a coworker, not a son. The text read, "Insurance on the '78 Ford expired. I took care of it. Need you to wire the money, $350, by Friday. No small talk, please." The frigidness cut David deeper than any shouted accusation could. It wasn't hate he read. It was distance and convenience, the total denial of any emotional bond. That aging '78 Ford F-100, rusting in Chris's backyard, was the last tangible vestige of a life David had abandoned. It was the car they had promised to restore together, a father-son project sealed with an awkward handshake when Chris was 10, before the road had swallowed David whole, reducing him to a presence only in the bank account. David felt the scorching sting of failure. He rested his elbow on the cracked rubber steering wheel, staring at the display. His thick fingers began to type a long, emotional response, detailing the solitary nights, the accumulated guilt of decades, and how much he missed the scent of Chris's garage. He wrote about how every mile driven was a sacrifice, but reading it over, the words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to bargain. He deleted the entire paragraph. He replaced it with a simple, yet firm, "Sending the money. Thank you." He was a master of logistics and numbers, an absolute failure with healing words. While hastily tidying his cab for the next haul, tossing out fast food wrappers and old maps, David's hand brushed against something hard beneath the passenger seat. It was a small toy truck, a dented plastic semi-rig, the paint worn thin, and a back wheel broken. It was the exact toy from the faded photograph he kept in his wallet. Chris must have left it there during his last hurried visit, perhaps 5 years ago. Holding that cheap plastic, which smelled faintly of dust and old diesel, brought an overwhelming rush of memory. Chris's small hand trying to mimic David at the gear shift, the desperate, silent longing in the boy's eyes for his total attention. David tossed the truck onto the upper bunk, where the checkered blanket lay. He tried to bury the guilt, but it was no longer an internal whisper. It was a tangible weight, like a poorly secured pallet of freight, refusing to stay put. He realized the most painful truth of his isolated life. Chris didn't hate him. Worse, he was indifferent. And indifference, David knew, was the cold graveyard where all love finally perished. The first sign that his life, built on miles of asphalt and perfectly isolated, was about to crack came not in the form of a dramatic letter or confrontation. It came from a dry, short, and coldly transactional text message. David was unloading a shipment of steel coils, the heavy cargo vibrating beneath his boots, in a noisy, dusty Atlanta yard. The smell of burnt diesel and sweat saturated the hot midday air when his phone, clipped to the dashboard of his Peterbilt, chimed with a sharp, insistent ping. It was Chris, now a 25-year-old mechanic, speaking with the professional precision of a coworker, not a son. The text read, "Insurance on the '78 Ford expired. I took care of it. Need you to wire the money, $350, by Friday. No small talk, please." The frigidness cut David deeper than any shouted accusation could. It wasn't hate he read. It was distance and convenience, the total denial of any emotional bond. That aging '78 Ford F-100, rusting in Chris's backyard, was the last tangible vestige of a life David had abandoned. It was the car they had promised to restore together, a father-son project sealed with an awkward handshake when Chris was 10, before the road had swallowed David whole, reducing him to a presence only in the bank account. David felt the scorching sting of failure. He rested his elbow on the cracked rubber steering wheel, staring at the display. His thick fingers began to type a long, emotional response, detailing the solitary nights, the accumulated guilt of decades, and how much he missed the scent of Chris's garage. He wrote about how every mile driven was a sacrifice, but reading it over, the words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to bargain. He deleted the entire paragraph. He replaced it with a simple, yet firm, "Sending the money. Thank you." He was a master of logistics and numbers, an absolute failure with healing words. While hastily tidying his cab for the next haul, tossing out fast food wrappers and old maps, David's hand brushed against something hard beneath the passenger seat. It was a small toy truck, a dented plastic semi-rig, the paint worn thin, and a back wheel broken. It was the exact toy from a faded photograph he kept in his wallet. Chris must have left it there during his last hurried visit, perhaps 5 years ago. Holding that cheap plastic, which smelled faintly of dust and old diesel, brought an overwhelming rush of memory. Chris's small hand trying to mimic David at the gear shift, the desperate, silent longing in the boy's eyes for his total attention. David tossed the truck onto the upper bunk, where the checkered blanket lay. He tried to bury the guilt, but it was no longer an internal whisper. It was a tangible weight, like a poorly secured pallet of freight, refusing to stay put. He realized the most painful truth of his isolated life. Chris didn't hate him. Worse, he was indifferent. And indifference, David knew, was the cold graveyard where all love finally perished. Armed with surging, consuming guilt and the dented toy truck, a rusted relic of what he had broken, David decided that what was required was not a word, but a grand, undeniable gesture. He had never known how to navigate emotional geography, but he understood the language of provision. Sitting in the dark cabin of his semi-truck, using an old laptop, the cold blue light illuminating the stress lines on his face, David researched Chris's work. He saw photographs of antique engines being meticulously restored, a craft requiring patience and precision, qualities David had rarely exhibited. He pinpointed Chris's critical need, a specialized, extremely expensive high-precision digital torque wrench, 50 to 300 lb-ft. David placed the order, feeling the sheer weight of the transaction. It was an amount that would force his budget tight for months, but to him, this was the cost of absolution. It was the only tangible form of care he knew. He had the tools shipped directly to Chris's garage. The accompanying card, bought at a truck stop and written with a cheap ballpoint pen, was brief, reflecting his deep inability to articulate depth. "Hope this helps. Love, Dad." David tried to visualize the scene. Chris opening the box, the weight of the tool in his hands, and perhaps a flicker of gratitude or understanding. He waited, his heart heavy, through 4 long days of empty routes. The rejection arrived at the Chicago freight terminal. The humid air smelled of diesel and cold metal. The heavy cardboard box was back. The card, now slightly soiled and crumpled, was taped to the side with industrial-grade duct tape. David's gaze locked onto the card. Chris had crossed out the word Dad with aggressive, dark pen strokes, and immediately beneath it, written David. Attached was a printed note, leaving no room for humanity, cold, impersonal, like a receipt of failure. Return to sender. I have my own tools now. Don't need charity. Keep your route. The phrase, keep your route, hit him like a physical lash, a brutal acknowledgement that David had chosen the asphalt over family. Instead of confronting the sharp pain of rejection, he tried to outrun it, taking an unnecessarily long route westward. 20 straight hours of driving, the Cummins engine rumbling a constant lament, the cab bathed only in the monotonous red glow of the dashboard. He used the physical exhaustion, the stiffness in his neck, the taste of reheated, stale coffee in his mouth, to stifle the emotional hurt that threatened to shatter him. He tried calling Sarah, his ex-wife, hoping her familiar voice might provide a map. The phone was heavy in his calloused hand. He heard the first ring, and then his throat seized, the words trapped, the shame insurmountable. He hung up before she could answer. Later, at a truck yard in Nebraska, he attempted to connect with Mike, a younger trucker who spoke of fatherhood with irritating ease. "Oh, my kid is going camping with me next weekend. You should try," Mike replied casually, wiping his boots. David's chest tightened painfully. He tried to form the words. "I tried to give him the world," but all that emerged was a rasping sigh. His gestures were grand, expensive, and filled with desperation, yet void of actual presence. He was attempting to pay an unpayable emotional debt, the lost childhood, with a material currency Chris utterly rejected. David realized, with a chilling dread, that the wall between them wasn't made of brick, but of the non-negotiable density of wasted time, and he had no way to rewind the clock. Every failed attempt only echoed Chris's judgment. It was, irrevocably, too late. Do you believe that time separates people or brings them closer? Comment. David's route thrust him into the untamed heart of the Rocky Mountains, just as a treacherous and vicious early blizzard descended. It wasn't merely snow. It was an angry, dense wall of white ice. David was racing against the clock, feeling the weight of 3 days of accumulated exhaustion, but for the first time in his 52 years, his long-haul ate, his sanctuary and livelihood, failed him. The transmission gave out not with a whine, but violent boom, a dry metallic snap that sounded like a bone breaking. An acrid smell of hot oil and grinding metal permeated the cab. David managed to coast the 18-wheeler giant to the side of a forgotten secondary road. The storm swallowed him almost instantly, reducing visibility to zero and muting the outside world. He was hundreds of miles from any major waypoint. His first attempt was the CB radio, the old communication lifeline that once bound the brotherhood of the road. Only cold, white static answered. The era where the king of the road's voice was always heard had died. Next, the cell phone. The battery icon flashed a desperate red, and David watched the service bars vanish one by one. His situation was beyond dire. It was life-threatening. The internal temperature in the cab, once cozy, plummeted rapidly, matching his emotional freefall. He called his boss, who, frustrated and concerned about liability issues, reported that rescue would take a minimum of 18 hours due to the extreme weather and isolated location. Sitting in the darkness, the silence broken only by the relentless howl of the wind against the truck's metalwork, David sank into his private emotional valley. He wasn't just stranded. He was utterly, catastrophically alone. The quiet of the cabin was not peace. It was a condemnation. He picked up the phone, his hands already trembling from the cold, and scrolled through his contacts. There was no one who could reach him. His ex-wife was years into another life. His closest trucking buddies were on the East Coast. He realized he had traded the deep security of human connection for the superficial illusion of self-sufficiency and importance on the highway. He had isolated himself so meticulously that in this hour of existential need, the world wouldn't even notice his disappearance, save for the overdue cargo. He thought of Chris. His son was only 5 hours away, at his small repair garage. David considered dialing the number, pleading for help, but shame paralyzed him more deeply than the cold. Asking for a logistical favor, a spare part, was easy. Asking for personal aid from the son he abandoned, admitting total failure, mechanical and moral, was impossible. He felt utterly unworthy of warmth or comfort. The long hall 8, once his proud shield, now lay broken, a mirror image of his life. He was freezing, and the coldest part was the knowledge that he had rejected love in favor of an empty cabin. David closed his eyes, wishing the blizzard had carried him away from his guilt forever. The blizzard raged on. The engine no longer produced heat, and David was becoming dangerously lethargic. The urgency of survival finally superseded pride. He grabbed his cell phone, almost dead, and typed a one-number sequence he knew by heart: Chris's. He didn't ask for help. He sent only a location pin and a single word: emergency. He knew Chris, as a mechanic, held a professional code of honor. Chris wouldn't come for the father. He would come for the code. David set the phone to charge minimally and closed his eyes. About 4 hours later, in the midst of the darkness and the snow, David was roused by a familiar sound, not the winch of a professional tow, but the roaring engine of an old Ford pickup. Chris. He stepped out of the truck, wearing a heavy, grease-stained jacket, his expression tight, professional, lacking any warmth. "What's wrong with the transmission?" Chris asked, without greeting, his tone strictly business. "David, you're freezing." The silence was thick, denser than the snow. David couldn't answer. He just pointed toward the engine. Chris immediately started working, his competence impressive. As Chris wrestled the cold and the steel, David saw the shadow of the 7-year-old boy in the man's back. He saw the strength David had never directly taught him, but which he had acquired on his own. David made a silent decision. He wouldn't try to apologize with empty words anymore. He would just be present, even if it hurt. He stumbled out swaying, and managed to brew 2 wee cups of coffee on the truck's small emergency stove. It was a tiny gesture, almost useless in the extreme cold, but it was the first time in years David had done something purely to serve his son, asking for nothing in return. Chris dropped the ball-peen hammer, the metallic clang echoing sharply in the damp darkness of the roadside. He stumbled back a step, exhausted, breathing hard. The steam from his breath rose in dense clouds, mingling with the acrid smell of spilled diesel and burnt oil. The hand that accepted the coffee, stained with grease up to the wrist, trembled slightly, not just from the biting cold, but from sheer contained frustration. He barely looked at David. "It's not the transmission. It's a master axle issue, material failure, caused by years of wear and, honestly, David, neglect." He trailed off, fixing his gaze on a point beyond the truck's headlight beam. The November cold was intense, but David noticed Chris was far more bothered by his presence than by the weather. "I could have called Rig 71, Chris continued, wiping oil from his face with his forearm. "A real professional, 30 miles down the highway. Why me? I'm not your father. I'm the mechanic who deals with your old junk. This truck and everything it represents." The word junk hit David where the cold couldn't reach, in the core of his pride, in the failure of the American promise he'd chased for 30 years. It was a verdict on his entire life. David hunched his shoulders and sighed his thin coat. "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking midway through the word, his pride utterly shattered by the cold and the fear. "You're right. I don't deserve you being here, not after all these years." He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a worn and familiar object wrapped in decades of silence and regret, a miniature red-cab Kenworth truck, missing one wheel and the front axle, chipped along several edges. "You left this on the dresser that morning. I kept it. For years." Chris froze, his body rigid. His eyes shifted from the grease to the toy in his father's palm. For the first time, the barrier of professional resentment in his eyes broke. "You kept it." His voice was a stunning mix of anger and childish, hurting disbelief. "I remember that day, David. I was on the living room floor crying, because you told me I was too big for toy trucks, but that the road was the only thing big enough for you. You left 3 days later." David stepped forward, his palms open, not an easy apology, but in a plea for truth. "I'm so sorry, Chris. I failed at everything that mattered. I loved the legend of the road. I loved the idea of being the man who came back rich to buy a ranch and give you everything. And by chasing that mirage, I missed the only thing you needed, my presence. I spent 20 years fixing broken parts on distant highways when I should have stayed to fix your bicycle tire. The tears came now, thick and hot, running down his gray, tired face. I missed countless mile markers. I didn't miss the roads, son. I missed your childhood. And if you never want to look at me again, I will understand. But I needed you to know that every mile I drove was a crushing weight on my chest. Chris looked at David, and the image of the invincible asphalt hero he so hated crumbled. He saw only a frail old man, shivering, bowed by guilt, not by the cold. Chris let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 2 decades. He didn't take the broken toy truck. He couldn't touch that symbol of lost innocence. Instead, he pulled off his thick, oil-stained gloves and reached out his hand to his father. A firm handshake, man to man, a painful yet real recognition. "Let's get you out of here, David," Chris said, his voice now neutral, yet carrying a new gravity. "The truck is going to spend the night. You're coming home with me." Forgiveness is not a single event. It is a door opening into the cold, and David had just stepped across the threshold. If you watch the story until the end, right? It's never too late. Chris's home was the antithesis of David's nomadic existence, modest, solidly grounded, and vibrating with a dual fragrance of warmed motor oil and slow-risen bread. It was the stability, the tangible stillness, that David had tried, and failed, to pack up and carry with him in every truck cab for 25 years. They didn't exchange many words that night. Forgiveness was a seed that needed to be planted in silence. Chris offered his father an immaculately kept guest room and hot, simple vegetable soup. In that bed, beneath the weight of a quilt that didn't tremble with the road's vibration, David slept more soundly than he had in 2 decades, feeling the weight of his absence finally replaced by the weight of a home. He woke to the familiar scent of diesel, not as an obligation, but as an invitation. That morning, Chris's detached garage became the field of truce. They started working on the truck, not as a father and son desperately trying to fix a broken past, but as 2 mechanics respecting the same cold language of steel. David, the road veteran, taught about the intricacies of the long-haul transmission. Chris, the practical craftsman, showed David an ingenious trick to break free a seized, rusted bolt that even a trucker's torque couldn't budge. They didn't speak about the lost childhood, yet with every wrench passed, every synchronized tightening, they were unconsciously bridging the gaps. David was no longer trying to make up for absence with gifts or regret. He was forging presence, quietly, moment by moment, through the bittersweet smell of old grease and new oil. Chris, though still reserved, shed the coldness he had worn like armor. In 3 days, the head gasket was replaced, and the old winter was rumbling again. When it was time for David to leave, he wasn't just loaded with his commercial freight. He was loaded with a heavy promise. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the single key to the old '78 Ford Mustang stored under a tarp in his warehouse garage. "Finish it, son. Make it your car. It's been waiting for you too long. I'll be here to help, not with money or expensive tools, but with my time, Saturday to Saturday." Chris smiled. It wasn't the cynical smirk of before, but a genuine smile, loaded with relief and acceptance, that illuminated David from the inside out, burning away years of guilt. They shared a firm handshake, a farewell more meaningful than any awkward embrace. David hit the road, and for the first time, the cab did not feel like a solitary confinement cell. The toy truck sat on the dashboard, this time with a superglue weld holding the broken wheel securely in place. He didn't take the 4-month route. He chose the route that would bring him back home in 4 weeks, regardless of the cost. He finally understood that life is not measured by the miles you travel in pursuit of profit, but by the sturdy connections you build and maintain along the way. True redemption, David realized, wasn't found in being forgiven by others, but in accepting that to win back love, you must, in body and soul, show up. It is never too late to become the father your son needed, but first, you have to stop the truck to find out where your home is. This story is a reminder that we all have a truck we need to stop in order to find what truly matters. If David's journey touched your heart and resonated with the power of second chances, please take a moment to share this message. Do you believe in the power of forgiveness and family? Let us know in the comments below. Who was the person you needed to forgive? If you value human stories of redemption and upliftment that prove it's never too late to reconnect, please subscribe to our channel. Click the bell to make sure you don't miss our next story. And remember, life is not a destination, it's the time we spend on the way. Until next time.